We're going to move on now and look perhaps further into the future and a bit broader. And the next speaker we have online is Staffan Qvist, who will talk about the security of supply to Baltics from Scandinavia and whether it is or is not in place. Staffan, I hope that you are also with us.
I hope so too. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Wonderful. And can you see my slides as well?
Not quite yet.
Okay. Give me a moment.
There we go.
Okay. So, not sure if I'm able to change the slides, but I guess I will just give a wave. So good morning, everyone, colleagues and friends in Europe, and everyone who's listening in from around the world. I will be stepping back a little bit away from nuclear topics specifically for the next 15 minutes. I was asked by Fermi to look at the status right now and going forward for the security of supply for the Estonian and Baltic power system. So there is a report that will be made public after my presentation today that summarizes this. I will try to summarize some of the findings from that report now. Obviously, it will be quite a brief overview, but hopefully we'll have time to go through some of the interesting things. So if you could change the slide. Sure, or if I'm supposed to be doing that. Yeah, so just very briefly then for everyone who is on this conference, but maybe not so familiar with Estonia and the Estonian power system, it's historically quite unique and that it's been based almost entirely on local oil shale. And mainly the power production in the system has been from a group of power plants near the oil shale deposits around Narva. And until recently, until a few years ago, I should say, this was supported as kind of a resource for ensuring the local security of supply of electricity and energy for Estonia. So it was a system that was quite energy independent in that sense. However, oil shale is very, very unenvironmentally friendly and not so climate friendly in that it has the highest emissions intensity of any comparable electricity production method. And obviously, it's not tenable to keep running a power system based on fossil fuels in general, and certainly not on one of the most emitting fossil fuels there is around. So consequently, from climate ambitions and also for the pricing of carbon emissions, the oil shale power production is shutting down. It's already been shutting down and it will continue to shut down. And what I was looking at in this little study is then what are the implications for the security of supply for Estonia and for the Baltic nations. So if we can go to the next slide. So in general, and this will be made more clear if you read the report, there are a few ways, if you summarize it, to ensure security of supply, which basically means that demand is met by production or imports. We can do that by having domestic dispatchable generation. That means power plants from which the production can be planned in the country. You can have domestic variable generation, which means production from, for instance, solar and wind farms locally. And then you can have imports. And the combined generation and supply from all of these sources should meet the adjusted demand that you have to ensure security of supply. So if we look first at domestic dispatchable generation, which is essentially these oil shale plants, one of the plants can also be fueled up to 50% by biomass. It's not only oil shale. If we look at what the situation is going forward with the domestic dispatchable capacity, this is in general throughout history how nations have secured security of supply, basically to ensure that you can meet your expected peak load more or less with plannable power in your country. In 2020, last year, there was enough available capacity assessed by the transmission grid operator to meet peak demand, even more than that. So there was no problem with energy security supply then, if everything was working fine. Now, this year, there will be decommissioning of oil shale plants, and going forward, this is going forward. So there's no published plans, at least by the study of Ellering, the transmission grid operator, of any construction of new dispatchable power generation, but the dispatchable power generation that is there is retiring. So you see from 2020 going out to 2030, even 2035 here, how the available capacity assessed by the transmission grid operator is reducing year by year. If we go to the next slide, we can compare this available dispatchable capacity with the expected peak load. So that's the expected maximum hourly consumption of electricity per year. It's quite flat if you see projections into the future, if you compare to other nations in the Nordic region. So this might be a little non-conservative if we assume that, for instance, the Estonian transport sector will transition to electricity and there will be electrification across the industry. This might actually grow more, but these are the reference numbers, and you can see there's a huge gap developing between the available dispatchable capacity and the expected peak load. So if we graph that out, the gap itself on the next slide. So in 2020, you could see that there is more dispatchable capacity available inside Estonia than the expected peak load. Already this year, that's changed. So not just on an annual basis or a weekly basis or a monthly basis, but this one looking at the peak hour. Even if you run all the plants that are dispatchable and they have the availability that you assume, Estonia cannot support its peak load by domestic dispatchable generation. In 2023, this situation gets quite a lot more dramatic. It goes down to almost 700 megawatts into the negative. And in 2030, with further retirements, it goes negative to on about a scale of 1 gigawatt, which is maybe not sounding so dramatic for people from larger countries, but that should be seen in relation to the peak load of about 1.5 gigawatts. So most of the power will need to come from something else. Which is a quite unique situation, actually, and a quite, as we will see, maybe a risky one. Okay, if you go to the next slide. So what is happening in Europe and also in Estonia to some extent, and is expected to be happening, is an expansion of variable domestic generation. So mainly wind power in the case of Estonia. It's not a very sunny place. And this also can contribute to some extent to security of supply. It's I will show to what extent, but obviously this is a production resource available in the country and needs to be assessed as such. So if we go to the next slide. So Estonian variable renewable generation is expanding. It will be, according to the ENTSO-E projections, at least able to generate about at least a third of annual demand by 2030. So demand is growing, but also the capacity of wind and solar is growing. You can see the current installed capacity in 2021 in the graph below, and what ENTSO-E is projecting might happen to 2025 and 2030. So quite a large expansion of this type of capacity might happen. The grid operator currently gives zero capacity credit to variable renewables, such as solar and wind, so they are not currently assessed in security of supply. Maybe they should be. We can look at that if we go forward. So if we take the next slide. Yeah, so if we can pull this out a bit more extreme, as is politically popular in Europe today, to look at what would it look like if we had 100% on an annual basis supply by variable renewables, and even 150%. How much, if we had capacity installed in solar and wind to be able to annually generate all the demand, or even 150% of demand, how much would that displace the need for dispatchable capacity or imports? So what kind of security supply implications does that have, that production capacity itself? So how do we look at that? Very quickly, if we go to the next slide, we looked at data, weather data, basically reanalysis of weather data for 35 years from 1982 to 2017. And the hourly capacity factors of onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar PV adjusted for those weather conditions, but using the latest technology. So the latest wind turbines, both onshore and offshore, but with the weather conditions that Estonia has historically experienced, and hourly load profiles adjusted for primarily the temperature profiles historically. And the relevant question here is, what is the biggest difference between the output of variable renewables and the demand over a certain time period? We looked from 1 single hour out to over 4 weeks. What we haven't done is a full probability study on this. It's purely deterministic, just looking at what the biggest gaps in supply might be. If we go to the next slide. So I would encourage everyone who's interested in this topic to go back and look at the uploaded slides from this presentation, because this graph is a bit complicated. It might not be enough time to explain it fully. So what these two lines, the 100% VRE and the 150% VRE lines are showing is how much average firm power, dispatchable power, do you need over a certain time period. So over a single hour, of course, there might not be any wind or sun at all. So you need averaged over a single hour, basically, to be able to meet the peak load without any contribution from solar or wind. If you go out to a longer time period, it's very unlikely there will be no sun and no wind over a very long time period. So the average need for dispatchable capacity obviously reduces, goes down. And if we look over a 1 or 2 week period, 2 week period is illustrated here just to give a sense of what needs to be in place, even if you do have 100% of supply annually from solar and wind. And essentially it does a little bit over a long time period, but you can have, in a small country like Estonia that's far in the north, basically very, very little wind and essentially no sun of note over even a 1 or 2 week period, during which something else needs to step in, obviously. Next slide. Yeah, so something else that's excellent to combine with solar and wind is obviously large-scale energy storage. So you might not have generation that week, but you might have had it the week before and you could store it. There's a very interesting project called Energia Salv, which plans to build a pump hydro storage facility, which will alleviate this problem a little bit and increase security of supply. So next slide, if we integrate all of this and look at what a week might look like from a security of supply perspective, we do get the next slide up. So this is a challenging weather week, which is a week with high load. So it's probably in the winter, yes, it's in January. It's got high demand, and we have very little solar and wind output. We are looking at a system designed to be able to generate 9 terawatt hours per year, so all of Estonia's needs over a year. But during this week, it's neither sunny nor windy. And even in a system like that, we're still missing about 1 gigawatt of power locally, so over an hour, and we're missing up to 100 gigawatt hours of energy over the week. So that's a deficit that we need to look at. We also did the same study for the Baltic integrated power system, so including Lithuania and Latvia, and the huge Lithuanian pumped hydro storage facility. And if you run into a bad weather week also in this system, you will discharge all of the storage you have roughly in the first day, and then you run into a deficit which needs to be covered somehow. And somehow it's quite obvious we can show that domestic dispatchable generation won't do it, dispatchable variable generation won't do it. It's imports that is supposed to do it, and we will look at that very briefly now. If you go to the next slide. So what is typically looked at and commented on, as far as I've seen and read about Estonian security of supply, is whether there's enough capacity to import to fill these needs. And the answer to that, on a very basic level, is yes, there will be enough transmission interconnecting capacity to other countries in the case of Estonia, Latvia, and Finland, to cover the import needs. So on a purely physical infrastructure level, I would agree, this assessment would agree that there's enough capacity to be able to do it. The problem, which we have assessed in the report, is, and if you go to the next slide, is that you don't only need enough cable capacity, you also need someone available that has excess generation capacity to be able to export to you when the system is stressed. And so for what's happening that's interesting in the Baltic region, obviously that will have huge impact, is a disconnect from the Russian, Belarus, and Kaliningrad systems, and no more electricity trade by the end of 2025. And what's remaining is basically to import in a two different northern routes from Norway and Sweden, or in a southern route from Germany and Poland. So essentially, security of supply in Estonia boils down to whether these two routes can be relied upon to supply Estonia in a time of stressed high load, low VRE output. And if we look at this, it is looking a bit risky, this strategy. There are many security of supply reports from the various grid operators in the northern region. What we're looking at here at the graph is one by the Swedish transmission system operator that's assessing the same situation for Sweden. And basically by 2023, in a stressed hour, they're saying basically only Norway can be relied upon to have any export capacity. So neither the northern routes nor the southern routes will have really any export capacity summed up over the route to get any power to Estonia during a stressed period. This situation is going to get worse. Norway is building large new interconnectors to other places. So their quite small excess capacity will be hard to bid for. And the demand, as Torbjörn explained, in Sweden is set to increase by up to 100 terawatt hours over the next 25 years per year. And Norway will also be increasing, and likely every country will need to increase electricity consumption to decarbonize. At the same time, the dispatchable capacity that's available is closing in neighboring countries. All of Germany's remaining nuclear plants will close. Sweden has closed 4 reactors quite recently, and obviously all coal power capacity will need to close in this region fairly soon. So if we go to the next slide. When I put together this presentation, I had a look at the data, and it was a very nicely illustrating time period, actually. I am in England right now, and we have a kind of a winter wonderland outside my window. We have snow on the ground for the first time since I've been here. It's wonderful. And it's cold everywhere. And during the time I made these slides, there was essentially no wind and no sun in Northern Europe. And so the Nordic region as a whole was importing enormous amounts of electricity, even as sometimes no individual nation in the north was a net generator of power. So this shows from the last of January to the 2nd of February when I made this, an import need regionally up to 7 gigawatts. And this was supplied primarily by Russia and Belarus, and by German coal and nuclear plants, and by Polish coal plants. Obviously, none of these sources will be available quite soon. German nuclear is shutting down. German coal and Polish coal will need to shut down for climate reasons. And the Baltic region is disconnecting from Russia and Belarus. So if it looks a bit risky today, it's not going to be better. So a summary, and I'm sorry for rushing through this. I have tried to cover a lot. Please sit down with the report if you find this interesting. The summary from this quite introductory, let's say cursory exploration of Estonian security supplies is a quite risky strategy that's being employed. The economic impacts are not just short term, which is the cost for power in a stress period and the risk of blackouts, but also long term, because if you have a power system that can't really ensure security of supply, you will hurt the willingness to invest from industry. Now, the import dependency that's developing in Estonia on all timescales, from a single hour to multi-year import dependency, makes the case for new dispatchable low carbon generation very, very attractive. And I would say, especially for combined heat and power plants, they can also do something like district heating. So from a security of supply perspective, it seems like an ideal opportunity, essentially as soon as practically possible, for something like up to 600 megawatt electric equivalents of SMR, ideally cogeneration enabled by the early 2030s, as soon as possible, basically. There's a case and there's a need for it to complement other low carbon sources like wind and solar. So thank you very much. I hope I kept roughly to time and didn't go too fast to be understandable.
Staffan, thank you very much. It is indeed interesting. If you don't mind, just one brief question. Hearing what you have to say, the question is really, well, is one SMR or is nuclear power in the capacity of 600 megawatt electric enough?
I think there will be a combination of solutions. There's a real easy case to make for something on the order of 600 megawatts, which will be able to run completely base load. I think, as you've seen, the net need, the net requirement for power that's not covered is far higher than 600 megawatts. So if you do run into a period where you've basically decommissioned all of the oil shale plants and you have 600 megawatts of SMR, no, you will not be able to cover security of supply. But there could be a combination of other ways to solve that problem, including more of these pumped hydro storage facilities, for instance, or even more nuclear power capacity, or more short-term solutions, such as maybe something biogas or biomass related. So 600 megawatts is probably a safe base case where you have an extremely strong economic case. That there's no kind of limit there.